All right there. Good afternoon, one and all. Thank you for taking time out of your busy days to log on in, and good morning, afternoon, and or evening to those who are watching the recorded session a wee bit later on. My name is Dr. Hannah Maswani. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Mission and Equity Consulting with YWCA McLean County. Just keeping an eye on our chat. So if you see me looking to the side, I promise for once it's not the various cats or dogs that I own that are trying to join in the session. We've got a packed hour for you today, talking about financial trauma. I want to take a little moment to say that it is YWCA USA's Week Without Violence, and part of our programming this year is to uplift financial trauma and financial abuse as unique and distinct categories of violence that do occur daily for so many of us. This will be a wee bit of a heavy presentation at times, so I ask folks to take care in the ways that they need to. Feel free to stay off camera. Feel free to privately chat questions to me if there's anything that I can do to be of support. And for those of you who are viewing later on, I'll be sharing my email, and you're always welcome to get in touch with any questions. One of the questions that kept coming up in terms of my research on financial trauma was, what is your money story? So I will not be asking folks to share either on chat or out loud. Don't worry, we're not going to compare bank accounts. But the idea of having a money story is, what is one's relationship towards money, towards finances? Oftentimes, the research shows that a lot of our sense of self is developed before the age of 7, and we are kind of sponges for a lot of the habits and beliefs and behaviors of our parents and other caregivers. So this made me think of growing up as a kiddo in Morocco and hearing a lot of the quips that I'm sure many of you have heard too, of money doesn't grow on trees, or I'm not made of money, or all the various different statements that our parents may have flippantly or pointedly shared that we sort of sponge up, we just soak up, and those become our kind of money mantras. And so when I'm talking about financial trauma today, with a caveat or content warning of some concepts of financial abuse also, but when I'm talking about financial trauma, this may be a little bit personal in some ways for folks listening. So again, practice that good care. But think about the first time that you were aware of money as even a concept, the first times that you were made aware that you either could afford something or did have financial permission as a reframe to do something, or the first times that you were told you could not afford or could not have access to something because of whatever money is or is not in our world. And so just to kind of ground us before we dive into a lot of the content in terms of our own money stories, our own upbringing, and our own relationship to money, to capitalism as a whole, to finances, those definitely impact the ways in which we relate to money as adults. So let's start with a question, or a second question, of what is financial trauma? You can kind of infer it by putting two and two together of what are finances, must be trauma around finances, but it's a really somatic experience. It's a cluster of physiological, emotional, and mental responses to events that are triggering. And those triggering events can be actual and or threatened financial harm. These can take shape in a number of different ways that we'll talk about today, but I wanted to highlight that it is, again, somatic, it's physiological. Money is more than just numbers. It's more than just that sort of rational brain adding two and two to get four. It becomes emotional. It becomes, again, about like the permission we have, the permission we give ourselves, or the permissions other people give us to have access to things that could equate fun or could equate freedom. And so financial trauma, like any other form of trauma, is both physiological and emotional. It's something that lives within our bodies. It's akin to the anxiety I feel every time I present, but also akin to some of those heavier, harder feelings when we are exposed to things that have been triggering to us in different ways. Financial traumas occur at any number of levels. So they can occur at the micro scale. So little digs of, I remember the first babysitting job I had, it will surprise very few folks to learn that I lost some of the money in a taxi on my way home. And that to me was a mini financial trauma. If I just worked hard, sitting with these pesky kids, doing the work that I needed to do, and then all of what I had sown and which I had reaped was gone. Or it can be something at a more macro level, like the fact that we have all, thank goodness, survived the pandemic for those of us who are here. Large scale events. So the pandemic, the subsequent inflation. I believe for those of my fellow millennials in the Zoom room, we're on our third financial crisis. And for those who may be Gen X or boomers are on their fourth. So we know that economic crises are also capital T financial traumas that impact us. But when we talk about macro systems, I also want us to think about, you guessed it, the isms. It would not be a YWCA presentation if we didn't talk about empowering women and eliminating racism, because things like racism, ideologies like sexism, things like ableism do impact our relationship with money, but also our access to money, to wealth, to wellness. And so a lot of times you'll hear folks talk about a desire for abundance, a desire for that cornucopia of resources that we would love to have. But unfortunately, the many, many, many isms that we live at the intersection of often lead us to doing without and can lead to scarcity mindsets, which compoundingly recreate themselves into, again, layer upon layer of emotional and financial trauma. I wanted us to sort of go over some of the signs or some of the indicators of what financial trauma is, and then we'll go through a framework of 4 ways that you may or may not, or others may or may not experience financial trauma. But if you're wondering, okay, Hannah, I get it. It's stress, it's anxiety, it's a triggered response to money. Surely we're all triggered by money. Why does this matter? And if that's what you're thinking, the answer to the first part of the surely we're all triggered by money is yes. A lot of us do have financial trauma that we normalize because we're in a very debt-friendly society, which I'll talk about in a wee bit. But we don't necessarily all respond to what could be financial trauma in the same way. So if financial trauma is something that affects you or someone you know, you may recognize some of these different signs that I've decided to break up into 3 different categories. And so I want you to sort of sit in your own respective bodies right now and think about different responses that you or other loved ones or maybe neighbors down the street have had when it comes to money conversations. These signs can be physiological. So the idea of being hypervigilant, always checking the accounts. Alternatively, it could be avoidance, never checking the accounts, right? Heightened startle responses, the kind of fight, flight, freeze of anxiety that we may see. Rumination, repeated thoughts, somatic complaints, the idea that you might have physiological and physical symptoms of stress. You feel your shoulders reaching up towards your ears as payday approaches or as payday leaves us, perhaps, and those physical signs of stress. The idea is that you can't sleep or you maybe oversleep to avoid. You can't eat or maybe you overeat to self-soothe. Ideas of having scarcity mindset, the feeling that that hypervigilance instills in you, where you feel your heart beating against your chest. And it's this scarcity mindset of, am I going to end up with nowhere to stay? Am I going to have enough to make ends meet? And a huge percentage of Americans do live ostensibly paycheck to paycheck. So some of this may hit close to home. And again, practice good care. Some of the other signs can be behavioral. So we can see either hyperfixation or obsessive compulsive behaviors or avoided behaviors. So are you, again, constantly checking the accounts? Are you getting that ATM receipt at the bank and making little origami figures so you don't have to look at it? Or are you constantly saving every single receipt to make sure that you're matching your bank account to your spending, to your savings? Is it something that takes up a lot of time in a way that you hyperfixate? Or is it something that takes up a lot of time in terms of trying not to think about? Some other signs can be workaholism. So the idea of folks constantly taking on second, third, fourth jobs, yes, to make ends meet, but also when it comes to financial trauma, to out of fear of not being able to make ends meet. So I want to be very cautious to not shame folks who do take on multiple roles or who do have very genuine fears of not being able to pay the rent or pay the mortgage or afford the next meal for themselves and their kiddos. It's a lot of times it can be that fear of what's tomorrow going to bring. So a key aspect of financial trauma, the trauma itself, the capital T traumatization of it lives in not knowing if you have enough for that day that you're in. But then the sort of financial trauma, overarching money anxiety also lives in not knowing if you'll have enough next week, not knowing if you'll have enough next month. So it's something that exists both in the here and now, but is also carried from past traumas, from past realizations of not having enough, from past fears of not having enough, and then also in the future of fears of not having enough. And a lot of times these are things we don't want to talk about in public, but they're anxieties that are ingrained in us, right? And so knowing that to folks on the call, like that's very, very real. Because like all forms of trauma and all forms of anxiety, they exist in the past, the present, and the future. And so I want us to kind of just tease that thread apart. One of the other areas in which financial trauma shows up is interpersonally. And this is where it can be really uncomfortable. And so, for folks who have been either in relationships or have had families, which is most of us, right? If not all of us, we've seen the ways that shame takes over. And so, for folks who are experiencing financial trauma, there's conversation avoidance or obsessive commentary on finances. One of the things I realized in my research on this topic is you can really compare a lot of the symptoms and a lot of the signs of financial trauma or disordered relationship with finances to disordered relationships that many of us have with food. So for folks who have eating disorders such as orthorexia, anorexia, binge eating, what have you, we can't avoid food. We need it quite literally to survive in a lot of the same ways that in today's day and age, we need finances to survive. So it's having these really, really heavy anxieties around things that are so unavoidable. And so these often show up to the right-hand side of your screen interpersonally. At times, that can be financial dependency on others or codependency on others, which we'll talk about a wee bit. Always love giving you the previews. It can be heightened reactions to things. So let's say you don't have enough change when you get to the checkout, or the person in front of you doesn't have enough change when they get to the checkout at your local Kroger or what have you, and you see them sort of blow up and get consumed by shame just because they're a few pennies off if they're still using cash, right? And you might think, okay, slow down, like it's not that big a deal, here's a quarter. But for them, it is that big a deal. And that's kind of how anxieties and traumas work, right? Where we may not necessarily understand the behaviors that we're seeing exhibited on the outside. We don't know physiologically what it's like to be like that on the inside. But interpersonally, we recognize that disconnect when someone has a reaction that's either bigger or a lot smaller than the reaction we might have. And so, what are the impacts of financial trauma? For those of you who've been in any of my trainings, I don't think a single training goes by where I don't talk about the millennial joke of avocado toast, that if only millennials spent less money on avocado toast, we'd all be homeowners. But it's more than about avocado toast. It's more than about intergenerational digs. It can lead to things like family dysfunction, substance use disorder, gambling out of the hopes of being able to get lucky and to be able to survive what can feel like a really oppressive system of capitalism. It can be physical and mental health conditions. It can be work impairment. Again, if you're taking on multiple jobs, are you going to be able to be your best and to be well enough to do that sort of thing? So you see all of these compounding. But what I took away from the research that I did on this topic is that, again, like with food, there is no avoiding money. As much as we kind of look away from our bank accounts, as further away we get from payday, we still need it in order to survive in the same way that we need food, in the same way that we need our avocado toast or whatever else our food is of choice. And I had to catch myself. I almost said vice, which is, again, the ways that we self-shame talking about things like this. A reality, particularly in American society and in the global north, is that we're very reliant on debt. And that as a country, we're trillions of dollars in debt, and the average American is at least $30,000 in debt, whether that's from healthcare, credit cards, student loans. There's really no avoiding it, where it's almost the expectation that an individual is tens of thousands of dollars in debt. So it becomes more than just the numbers, especially when I say, hey, have you got $30,000? And most of us might chuckle and go, not in my account, but yes, in my debt. We're in a society that has us function in the red. It has us function in a net negative in ways that can only be stressful because we're always taught about how to be independent, how to be able to make it. But as a whole, we function in the red pretty often to the point where it's the expectation. And so that's where we might see some of these symptoms come about. But for the bulk of today's session, I wanted us to think about where financial trauma happens on a 4-point framework. And so I'll be diving into each of these with you today. It's happened historically, but it's absolutely also happened presently. So I won't be talking about historical too much because it's something we all live right now, but I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork. It happens relationally, aka interpersonally. It happens individually, and it happens to us across societies as well, or in different communities. So let's kick things off with historically. Where does financial trauma happen? Oops. I invite us to think about the days of the Declaration of Independence and who we, the people, encapsulated, who was actually captured within that phrase, who were considered citizens, who had the privilege to amass wealth, to gather resources, to own land, to own property, who was considered property. When did we all receive our unalienable rights? Have we all received our unalienable rights? And what barriers are placed in terms of preventing these rights from being accessible? And so if we think about historically, we know that Black folks were not able to own property and were in fact viewed as such. In a society where historically for the past, like whether it's 400 years or past 100 years that we look at, particularly pre-civil rights movement, where things like redlining occur, where intergenerational wealth is barred, where incarceration stops folks from being able to make more than pennies an hour, let alone live freely. So we know that historically there's a compounding effort. Think of it in terms of gardening, a metaphor I didn't anticipate using. But if you were to plant a tree today and you forbade me from planting my tree until 100 years from now, when I'm sure I will still look just as youthful and vivacious, whose tree is going to be sturdier? Whose tree is going to have the hardier roots in 100 years? Well, yours will. Mine will be a sapling and yours will be a tall, mighty oak. And it's kind of the same way when we think about community wealth and we think about the ways that community wealth has and hasn't been encouraged. It's also, if you think about the roots of intergenerational trauma versus intergenerational wealth, the roots of trauma are a lot deeper and are a lot stronger and reach further for communities that have been disenfranchised. And so I wanted us to think about the ways that we view money. There's an Iroquois principle of the seventh generation where Iroquois Indigenous folks make decisions based off of what they can do well now to also be good for 7 generations from now. So there's this idea of sustainability, which is really counterintuitive to how we live today, right? The only thing that we know lives 7 generations long is epigenetically the traumas that we have, including financial trauma, and that it takes 7 generations for somebody to be relieved of the hardships that affected their ancestors that many generations before. So both epigenetically and financially. If we think about other communities that were disenfranchised, we know that women were barred from land ownership, from home ownership, from divorce, from work if they were married or pregnant, and that's within the lifetimes of many of you watching today. But also women were barred on a more intimate level in the household from making decisions. Households traditionally have been set up into earners and spenders. And so men typically occupied the earning role, women occupied the spending role, and the spending role was often policed by the men who were in the position of earner. And so what that has created is generation of young girls and young women, and then older women, seeing financial codependency role modeled by their mothers, seeing a reliance on one primary breadwinner, excuse me. And that creates a disparity in terms of access to money and also fluency around how we do talk about money and how we do spend money. So let's talk individually, knowing that the history is kind of the bedrock from where we grow, right? So individually, what does financial trauma look like? It can be the impact of poverty on our mental health. It can trigger anxiety, depression, all the different things that we talked about before that can come with any form of trauma. It can happen when we grow up with limited resources and we see that role modeled. Again, our formative years and seeing how our parents talk about money becomes how we talk about money. Alternatively, it can also be growing up in relative comfort and wealth and hearing the narratives that we hear now about the Great Recession 2.0 and the fear of that happening, one's identity being so linked towards wealth and affluence. So as I'm talking, I realize a few of you may be thinking, girl, is there any way around it? It sounds like no, but I do promise there are some data-backed ways to counteract financial trauma. Also, our individual financial traumas can be amplified by witnessing loved ones struggle as well. So some of these sources can be our financial instability. It can be job loss. We know that the job market is particularly cruel these days. It can be from childhood experiences, increasing financial responsibility. We all know that one moment when we're either teens, maybe younger, maybe older if we're more fortunate, when you realize that your paycheck doesn't just go for the fun stuff, that, oh, wow, I have to pay my electric bill too. And you realize that a mortgage is a fun thing to have. Those moments of increased financial responsibility and the anxiety that hits, oftentimes our increased financial responsibility happens in our teenage years. Again, if we're fortunate, it happens in our teenage years. I don't want to discredit or not speak to many children who are breadwinners in their families, right? Especially in marginalized groups. But oftentimes it is in our teen years when we become more aware of the world outside us that financial traumas start being things that we have language for, or start being things that we notice, even if we don't have language for. And that's at a time when our brains are developing. Y'all remember puberty. Many of us try not to. It becomes real hard when you're trying to figure out your sense of self, and then your sense of self-worth is muddied by the idea of, oh, who's richer, who's poorer? Am I rich if my parents have money, or am I still poor? Am I allowed to talk about having things, or is that a faux pas? And these are some of the other sources here, like lack of savings, lack of access to cash or credit, lack of, or abundance rather, of credit card debt and other forms of debt, again, that have become so normalized. So for those of you who are wondering, MOM, that's month over month inflation readings. We know that individually and communally, we're experiencing increases in inflation that are exponential, particularly over the past 24 years. And this is data as recently as this year, where things like shelter in particular have quadrupled in expense for some, things like energy, things like food, even medical care services have doubled in recent years. And so when we think about how minimum wage hasn't really reached the point of living wage, and we see inflation be this catastrophic, for lack of a better word, I realize I'm boosting everyone's anxiety in the call, right? And so it's something that we live. It's something that I don't need to speak to too terribly much, but it is where financial trauma lives as well. Since 2015, we have reached our highest levels of money stress, as reported by several studies, including a couple by Forbes, in the United States. So stress is at its highest levels since the first recession that may be in living memory of 2008 to 2015. And we've seen a shrinking of the middle class. So why am I sharing all these depressing statistics? It's because there's so many of them, and just because I want to frame this as something valid, not to overwhelm those of you who are tuning in, but to amplify that any anxiety that you're feeling is not alone. And one of the solutions, or one of the ways to address and hopefully mitigate financial trauma, is to recognize that it's not just an individual experience. So while this is the individual part of the 4-point framework that I'm using, it's one that we all feel together, even though we don't talk about it. Because what are the things that you don't talk about at the dinner table? It's politics, it's sex, it's also money, because it's something we're told not to. And when you don't talk about something, that leads to increased feelings of shame. And so part of my way of stressing us all out today, I do apologize, is to speak as neutrally as possible about the fact that, yeah, only half of Americans make up the middle income, as compared to 61% only a few years ago. Again, within living memory for many. It's a compounding issue. I will confess that I have fallen victim to the surcharges on bank accounts several times in my life, where it is absolutely one of my either little t or capital T traumas. That's something for me to figure out in therapy, where you can see based off of this image here, not having your money, even when you have enough money, it being taken out in the wrong order, or variables beyond your control, can lead to this compounding issue. Banks made over $2.2 billion in annual overdraft fees. So that's profiting off of those of us who don't have enough. Single serve items cost more per item than bulk purchases. We know payday loans are only starting to really be regulated, and we know that landlords can execute different forms of bias based on their whims and reject state and federal funding to support landlords. So I'm talking about all the isms. I'm talking about this as a compounding issue, because it's one, again, that we may think of our own little slice of the pie, but we're all eating off the same plate, right? So it's something that, again, is kind of universally understood. which is where we get to the third point of community experienced financial trauma. So we know that historically and also present day, financial discrimination can stem from racial, cultural, religious, and other societal biases. For example, a quarter of unhoused youth are LGBTQ, where they really only make up 10 to 15% of the youth population. We know that members of non-dominant cultural and religious groups experience marginalization that often impact their ability to work and to earn wages. And we know that upwards mobility does not look the same across racial and ethnic identity groups. So upward mobility, or the ability to increase your tax bracket, so to speak, is predominantly experienced in white families versus other families. It's predominantly experienced among straight families as opposed to LGBTQ families. And so what does that mean for us? It means that we have an over-reliance as a society on one number in particular. I said it's about more than just one number, but when we think about things like credit scores, there is a direct correlation between lower credit scores and instances of increased discrimination. So I'll share that being an immigrant to the United States, having only got my first credit card right when I turned 30, I was very much thinking, well, how come other folks my age own homes and have 790 credit scores, and I'm sitting here at a number that I don't want to share out loud because the shame is still felt even as I teach about it. It's something that we realize our credit scores are not just representative of us. They don't reflect who we are, but they do reflect the systems that those before us and ourselves exist within. So my credit score doesn't tell you if I'm a great person or not, but it does tell you a little bit about my backstory in terms of my access to credit. And so that's one of the tips that I want to offer is taking things like the number in our bank account, taking things like our credit score, especially on the days that they make you feel bad, which is a lot of days sometimes for some of us. How do you look at that number and not see it as a reflection of your worth? Your credit score isn't your report card. It can feel like it. It can feel like, why am I a C student, not an A student? But seeing it as an indicator of larger systemic issues, of larger community issues, as a way to sort of, okay, my credit score tells the story of my people. It does not tell the story of me. And so, especially when you see this disproportionate data, particularly for LGBTQ folks, which I was shocked by, despite how much I read about all things LGBT, it was helpful for me as a reframe to say, well, of course it's this number, because this number exists along a spectrum of our society's way with numbers. We know that the wage gap exists. So again, when you think about your bank account, when you think about the latest check you received, is that a commentary on you? No, it is a commentary on where you are, given the identities you have, and given the systems that you are up against or either part of, right? And so for me, it wasn't a solution that I found in a lot of the research, but it was one that I find personally helpful in terms of reframing how we look at money as not being a sense of worth, not as a sense of self. And so we know that the gender wage gap exists across LGBTQ communities. It exists across immigrant communities as well. I have a ton of different data here. And so I encourage you, especially if you're watching this later on or want to take a screenshot on your screens right now, to know that where you are on this spectrum is where you, as in societally, you are across the spectrum. And it's a really tough thing to not see it as a personal reflection of you. But it's one that I encourage us to think about. And so I can't not laugh when I think about this next section. According to financial planners, economists, we are about to be across the great wealth transfer, the greatest wealth transfer in all of United States history. And that sounds really exciting when I say, ooh, we're transferring wealth, right? But what does it mean to transfer wealth? Well, I'm talking about intergenerational wealth. It is the transfer of financial assets, resources, and I would include knowledge and well-being from one generation to another. My wife made the joke when we were doing some landscaping, we needed to get a saw. Her father, who's also an immigrant, had a saw, and we're like, that's generational wealth. It's knowing that you have someone to go to for the one thing you need, whether it's, a legacy that's left afterwards or like those little resources. Financial intergenerational wealth is also knowledge. I still don't really know what a Roth IRA is because no one in my family was ever exposed to what that was, and it wasn't part of the language I grew up in. Have I Googled it? Yes, I have. Does my own financial trauma and anxiety mean that my brain doesn't fully understand it? Also, yes. But when we think about intergenerational wealth, we hear this narrative, and I want to offer this as sort of a gift for future you. We hear this narrative that we're coming up to the great generational wealth transfer, where $53 trillion will be changing hands in the United States. What does that mean? That sounds exciting to me. Or does it? When we talk about the transfer of $53 billion, we're talking about baby boomers gifting or leaving legacies to Generation X folks and millennials. It is the wealth transfer of assets that will happen either posthumously or within their lifetime, where we will see wealth traverse generations. This is one of my favorite stats, especially for those of us in the room who are either Gen Z, millennials, or even Gen Xers, where we see that wealth is not spread evenly across generations. And I want to be careful that I'm not shaming any generation here, right? Because there's always this idea of like younger years are your struggle years, and then things get better as you get older. We absolutely hope so. But in older years, that's also where we see, excuse me, I almost got ahead of myself. Older years is where we see a lot of our debt come from too. So just to offer this as a snapshot in time about where the age distribution of wealth is. So if older generations are leaving $53 trillion to younger generations, should we all put our hands out like money, please? Yes, and also no, because only just under 7% of US households have a net combined worth of over $1 million. And so why am I talking about this? Why am I talking about the great transfer that could be? It's because in the next few years, we're going to see increased dialogue around, yay, great wealth transfer. Millennials are going to be rich. No, some millennials, those who are already part of family and household structures that are already affluent, will remain affluent. It'll just be in their bank accounts and not their family bank accounts. And so it sounds silly for me to sort of be warning about rhetoric that's around the corner, but I find it good to have the knowledge ahead of time so that we're not buying into this narrative that we should also be millionaires and billionaires. Should we be? Of course. But do the numbers pan out that way? Unfortunately not. The other aspect of the great generational wealth transfer, before I move forward, is that younger generations and older generations alike are saddled with medical debt and student loans. So remember how I said as a society, we all live in the red? That holds true for this as well. So a lot of these trillions of dollars are already spent or already bespoke for different expenses that come. And so I realize saying this training out loud now, beyond my dress rehearsals, it's a lot of depressing information. So where does that leave us? Well, here, where we see that our pension entitlements are shrinking as we go on, where we see our real estate is shrinking, where we see that our stocks and investments are desperately shrinking also. And so what do we do with that information? Again, we find that with kindness and community, we reframe this as a structural issue and not a personal issue. So in the same way that somebody may say something sexist to you, that is not a commentary on you. It is a commentary that comes from a system that is doing harm. Again, it's not a reflection of you. It is a reflection of a system that is doing harm, or in the financial trauma case, a system that is imbalanced. And lastly, relationally. So this is a lot of the conversation where we would see financial trauma take place between people. And funnily enough, this is both the most talked about area of financial trauma, but the least talked about area of abuse. And so for a content warning, for those who may need to step away or hit pause, I will be talking about domestic abuse, not any specific examples, but as a whole concept. So again, practice good care. What is relational trauma, or excuse me, financial trauma relationally? Oftentimes it takes the form of financial abuse, which is a common tactic, one of the most frequent tactics used by abusers to gain power and control in a relationship. Oftentimes, in instances where there is physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse, there is also always financial abuse. It's almost always correlated or occurring simultaneously to that. But we typically don't talk about it because when you see instances of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse also happening, those take precedent typically because of our narrative as a society of not talking about money, but also because of those three areas, there is a propensity to do so much harm so quickly. Not that financial abuse is not harm, but financial abuse typically doesn't leave bruises and scars and other signs that we are taught to look for when it comes to patterns of relational abuse. And so again, financial abuse is one of the more talked about areas of financial trauma, but one of the least talked about areas of financial abuse. It's important to know that financial abuse may be overt and subtle. It may be a partner withholding their partner's credit card or shredding them. It may be stealing money from a partner or a loved one or a trusted individual stealing money from another individual, but it also may be subtle. It may be concealing or withholding information. It may be well-intentioned. It may be not wanting to trouble someone with financial details out of a desire to protect them when that person doesn't want protection, they want access to information. So like with all forms of abuse, it's messy, it's tricky, it's hard to necessarily point out exactly what is capital A abuse, but all forms of abuse are problematic and all forms of abuse need to be stopped. Financial abuse can also take the shape of somebody impeding their partner's ability to earn money. And so one may not think of it in that way, but if I forbade my partner from having a job, that could be considered a form of financial abuse because I am stopping their ability to have any financial autonomy. And the same thing would be true vice versa. And this exists regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation. There was a really depressing fact that, surprise, a depressing fact for me, I know. There was a very depressing fact that as many as 80% of teenage relationships have some evidence of financial abuse present in them. And so the data skewed between 60% to 80%. We could land on a 70 if we want to, but around 3 in 4 teenage relationships had some signs of financial abuse, whether that was taking money, withholding money, or expecting things like sexual favors in response for money. And I wasn't planning on talking about that example, but it bears discussing where if there is the idea of, I bought you dinner, you must do said act for me or perform some sort of something for me. That's quid pro quo in terms of sexual harassment, but it's also a form of financial abuse, particularly and especially when the person who received this gift or received this meal, A, did not know that it was in a quid pro quo situation, was supposed to expect that this was they had to pay back for, or thirdly, when they do not have the ability to necessarily compensate financially and thus feel that they are backed in a quarter in which they have to respond to that. And so the reason I do want to bring up the idea of like, well, I bought her dinner, I'm going to get lucky, that kind of language is because we hear so much of it, particularly in straight dating, that we don't necessarily discuss, that we don't necessarily consider as a form of abuse or as a form of potential financial trauma because it could be triggering for any number of reasons for people. So things that I want us to be cautious of, and there's just a few more slides, my friends. That financial abuse is often the first sign of dating violence and domestic abuse. So again, apologies to those who are survivors of this or those who may need to take a minute, but financial abuse is any form of control or spending of money that could then turn into control of any other aspect of someone's life. It could be ruining credit history. One of the underspoken about things, if that's a way I can phrase that, is the idea of taking credit cards out in someone else's name. Unfortunately, folks will do this for partners or for even their children as a way to survive. So you see a case where hurt people hurt people. So let's say I was a financially disempowered person. I had a child, the child shared my name. I could potentially open up a credit card or a line of credit for my child who's also named Hannah Maswani because of my financial trauma, my fear of not making it. But then little Hannah grows up and realizes, oh, that was a financial abuse done to me. That was identity theft. And now little Hannah has her own financial trauma that she has to go through. And so you can see how, especially when we consider historical and present day communities that are oppressed, that are disempowered and disenfranchised, how it becomes a cyclical situation. Again, any feelings of entitlement that are rooted in money, whether it's I have money, I give you this thing, or your money is my money and my money is also my money, those are indicators of financial abuse. And then any interference with one's ability to earn or one's ability to manage their own finances as well. And so what are the types of financial abuse? Again, it could be confiscating access to independent funds. And so oftentimes advice to couples is that you have one shared account and two separate accounts, one each. Of course, money is private and personal. Oftentimes when we think about things like divorce, like pre-divorce statements, prenups, excuse me, that was a prenups, the idea of like, oh, don't you trust me? We're taught to sort of be skeptical about having neutral conversations about money of, yes, I trust you and I need access to independent money. Because if we think about money like we think about food, it would be akin to making the same promise of like, hey, Liz, you promise that you don't eat unless I eat too. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with like one's appetite and one's ability to earn and spend is not directly correlated to someone just because there's a relationship or there's an existing partnership there. And so oftentimes we see the flowery language of love and romance obscure the independent nature of money and the need for independence and agency for money, because money is agentic. Money is something that does happen individually for people. Oops, I see somebody else joining. All right. Racking up debt on shared accounts or joint credit cards, frivolous spending when someone asks you not to, withholding financial support like child support payments is another form of financial abuse. That is one that is unfortunately very, very normalized everywhere from TV shows to lyrics, but is a form of financial abuse. And it's important to note, in the same way that we talk about sexual harassment, even things that are perceived as little or slights like frauderization or what have you, they might seem too small to constitute abuse. But again, when we talk about the pyramid of violence, which I believe is my next slide, you see how it all interplays together. Another form of financial abuse is flat out refusing to contribute anything to the household income. So whether that's my money is my money, your money is our money, or whether that's a refusal to work and a refusal, not an ability to, but a refusal to work. And I want to be careful to say it's not for folks who cannot work, for whom work is not a viable option, but it's an ability to that is then denied out of just preference for. And it's a decision, and it's important to note in households where one parent does work and another person doesn't, housework is work, child rearing is work. These are all jobs, and it's something that has to be negotiated between partners. So we may see signs of financial abuse. You may check in on a friend and they may feel fine with it and they have their reasons and explanations for it, and that's grand. But these are just some of the types and signs for us to be aware of and us to just sort of give pause for thought for when we see these kinds of things. The most egregious form of financial abuse does take place in human trafficking. Again, it's something that we don't necessarily code as being financially traumatic because it is all other forms of trauma too, whether that's for labor or for sex labor. I want to give us a little moment to kind of review these slides. It's important to note, just as I said, that between 60 and 80% of teen relationships have signs of financial abuse, a huge number, and it's hard to find what the statistics are because it's so underreported, but a huge number of those who are sex trafficked and labor trafficked are children, particularly youth. So when I talk about youth being aware of financial responsibilities, coming into their own as young adults, that is an opportune time for, unfortunately, for abusers to strike and to take place. And so I wanted to give a shout out to the Center for Prevention Abuse, great local organization that does offer support to survivors and offers a number of great trainings too about how human trafficking works and how human trafficking occurs here at our local schools. And the state of Illinois, it is not just something that is hotel rooms abroad. It's not just something that is impacting immigrants, although it absolutely is impacting immigrants. It also impacts folks who are United States citizens too. And so just to kind of reframe, destigmatize that. And again, human trafficking as a form of extreme financial abuse is a form of financial abuse and typically attacks those that are most disenfranchised. All right, so what can we do? I've given us a lot of really depressing information. I know that, but hopefully a lot of good information as well. One of the things we can start to do is to destigmatize conversations on money. Having been in whether it's partnerships or friendships where there's that automatic anxiety of like, can I ask you what your salary is? We have to just make numbers numbers. We have to try and stop having our credit scores be reflections of us. We have to be able to say, hey, I make this amount of money. Do you also make this amount of money? Because when we talk about money, we lessen the opportunities for financial discrimination in the workplace. We know that the gender wage gap is real. We know that the gender race gap is real. So we have to destigmatize conversations on money. Don't wait until you and your partner are buying your first home to talk about what's in your bank accounts, right? It should be something collaborative. And so one of the tips later on the list is to schedule money talks. And so in the same way that in relationships, in family situations, we talk about the birds and the bees, or we should talk about the birds and the bees, we should also talk about the Benjamins and the Franklins, although that is one president my immigrant status is showing. So we have to reduce, I apologize for my jokes. We have to reduce shame when we talk about money because reducing shame reduces harm. We have to address the elephants in the room. There's a reason it's called an elephant in the room and not like a little bumblebee in the room because elephants are giant. We will notice them. As a society, we are numb to debt. We expect to be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, but we don't talk about it. We sort of make flippant jokes of like, oh yeah, my student loans will live longer than I will. And like, I'm guilty of making these jokes too. But it's important to not self-deprecate too much because then again, our sense of self comes into it and we financially re-traumatize ourselves. So again, we're in this weird dichotomy of being numb to debt and overwhelmed by it. So how do we sort of balance the two of those things? We want to boost empathy and generosity. We want to stop judging people for getting a latte and eating their avocado toast. We want to stop judging folks for having new phones because you can afford a car if you can afford a payment, right? It's not necessarily that we can afford all the things we have. Money is practiced differently than it is talked about. And so we have to boost empathy and generosity. And if you need a little treat to get through the day, and that's fine. And if you don't, that's also fine. But we have to stop shaming each other for how we spend. And we have to stop presuming that folks who are financially disenfranchised are unable to spend their money well, because there's more to it than just decision making. Because again, your credit score and your bank account is not a reflection of you. It is a reflection of your situation, which includes systemic aspects as well. And then lastly, watch for signs of abuse, whether that's in your own relationships or those of others, because again, abuse exists financially across the spectrum of the pyramid of violence, excuse me. It is really under talked about, but it happens somewhere between verbal harassment and physical harassment, where we're harassing or, disempowering folks from the ability to be autonomous and agentic. And we want to be mindful of that. As with all things, if you do see any signs of sexual abuse, if you are a survivor thereof, Stepping Stones is here for you as well. And they are fantastic and know how financial abuse does lie into other forms of abuse too. So I want to say thank you for your time. For those of you watching recorded, I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can have a little bit of a confidential space for any of our real-time attendees who may want to join in conversation or ask questions. If you are watching online later on, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, thoughts, or concerns that you might have. Thank you.